ecosystem here in Houston and how Houston can maintain its preeminence as the energy capital of the world. Joining us today are Barbara Berger, Jan Odegaard, and Brad Burke, who are with me here in our conference studio at the Baker Institute, and Laura Cottingham, who joins us remotely from Denver, Colorado. And I'd like to introduce each of our speakers. Immediately to my right, the audience's left, is Barbara Berger, who is a self-described recent graduate from Chevron, where she ended her time with the company as Vice President of Innovation and President of Chevron Technology Ventures. During her 34-year career at Chevron, Barbara held management positions across 6 different divisions, as well as a number of civic and industry leadership roles, including the governing board of the MIT Energy Initiative, the External Advisory Council for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, the Greentown Houston Advisory Council, the Rice University Corporate Innovation Advisory Board, Houston Exponential, the Activate Leadership Council, the Houston Symphony Society, and the board of the investment arm of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, OGCI. Barbara has recently joined the Advisory Council of Emerald Technology Ventures, a global venture capital firm focused on big challenges in climate change and sustainability. She holds a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of Rochester, Ph.D. in chemistry from Caltech, and an MBA in finance from Cal Berkeley. Barbara, welcome.
Thank you.
Next to my right is Jan Odegaard, the executive director of the Ionyon, which is the 250,000 square foot technology hub launched in 2019 in Midtown Houston. Through facilities, partnerships, and programs, the Ionyon brings together corporate innovators, academic partners, startups, and entrepreneurs in an atmosphere of dynamic collision, as Jan has described it. Interestingly, the Ionyon's first commercial tenant was Chevron Technology Ventures, and the person who initiated that lease was Barbara Berger. Prior to joining the Ionyon, Jan served for 8 years as executive director of the Ken Kennedy Institute at Rice, where he launched 2 industry-leading programs, the Oil and Gas High Performance Computing Conference and the Ken Kennedy Institute Data Science Conference. Previously, Jan was professor and department chair of electrical and computer engineering at the University of Stavanger in Norway and an award-winning research director at Rice. Jan studied electrical engineering at Norway's Telemark College of Engineering, earned his BS and MS at Texas A&M, and his PhD at Rice. Jan, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Next to the right is Brad Burke. He is the founding managing director of the Rice Alliance for Technology and Entrepreneurship. Since its inception in 2001, the Rice Alliance under Brad's leadership has seen over 3,000 startups take part and has raised more than $23 billion in funding. He has also led the Alliance's Rice Business Plan competition to become the largest and richest collegiate startup competition in the world. Before joining the Rice Alliance, Brad founded the Houston office of Viant, a startup that went public in 1999. He previously worked as a sales manager and financial planner at ExxonMobil and in management consulting and systems integration. Brad has a BS in Business Administration and Computer Science from Vanderbilt and an MBA from Northwestern. And joining us remotely is Laura Cottingham, the Chief of Staff of Greentown Labs, which is the largest climate technology startup incubator in North America. Founded in Boston in 2011, Greentown launched its Houston incubator in 2021 across the street from the Ionyon, and it now has over 60 member startups. Before joining Greentown, Laura served for 7 years in the City of Houston's Sustainability Office, the last 4 as Chief Sustainability Officer for the city. She has worked extensively in finance and government since 2005. Laura earned her BA as a triple major at the University of Texas, as well as an MBA in energy finance and public affairs, also from UT. Through the magic of technology, she joins us today from Denver, Colorado, where she is attending an important energy conference. Thank you very much, Laura, for joining us. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here today. And I hope that through our conversation here, we're able to really take a deep dive into the energy entrepreneurship ecosystem here in Houston. And I'll start with sort of a foundational question. What is an ecosystem? and particularly an entrepreneurship ecosystem. That's become a hot phrase in the last several years, so I will ask you, what does it really mean? And can each of you describe the sort of ecological niche, if you will, that your work plays in the ecosystem? And we'll start with Brad.
Super, George. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and the opportunity to talk about the ecosystem, which is so important. And maybe it's appropriate that I start because I have probably been around this ecosystem or involved in it maybe longer than other folks have. And you know, it started back when the Rice Alliance was founded in 2000. And we were really founded with the vision that Rice University ought to step up and play the role that Stanford plays in the Bay Area, or that MIT plays in Boston. And so we began the organization, and as you mentioned, we've seen since then, 22 years ago, we've seen over 3,000 startups come through our program who've raised over $23 billion in funding. But you know, what has transpired over that is what I would call building up the ecosystem. And the ecosystem includes hundreds of corporations like Chevron and Chevron Technology Ventures, hundreds of investors, hundreds of mentors, and hundreds of advisors and service providers who've created this network to support those startup founders who want to launch their company. So we take advantage of that ecosystem by providing education and mentoring for early stage founders through programs like the Clean Energy Accelerator that we just launched last year, or through our energy technology venture forums that bring together later stage startups with corporates and investors who are, the startups are either looking for their pilots, they're looking to raise revenue, generate revenue, or looking for investment funding. You know, with all of the players in Houston, the corporates, the investors, the service providers, I think that Houston probably has the best energy and most robust energy ecosystem in the U.S., which has only gotten better through the Ionyon and through Greentown Labs being here. So it's a pleasure to be here today.
Well, thank you, Brad. Now that sets up the next part of the question quite well. Laura, can you tell us about Greentown Labs and its ecological niche, if you will?
Absolutely. So thank you for letting me join you remotely. I'm excited to be here today. So I'm the Chief of Staff at Greentown Labs, and we're North America's largest climate tech incubator. So we are a physical incubator. Currently, we have over 140,000 square feet of space. That's wet labs, that's prototyping, office and community space. You mentioned we were founded over 10 years ago in Somerville, right next to MIT. And we're excited to have been in Houston for just over a year. So Greentown's mission is to convene and connect and inspire entrepreneurs, but also ecosystems to advance climate solutions. So we do so by supporting the startups with what they need to be successful. That can be virtual tools, business tools, but also physical tools. A lot of our startups are very hard tech, and that's because we're focused on the solutions to solve the climate crisis and build the energy transition. Our startups focus on the hardest to decarbonize sectors, so buildings and transportation, agriculture, water, and energy and power. These are things you don't want to build in a garage or in your dorm room, and so they really need space. We have been pretty successful over the past 10 years, where we've been able to help a lot of startups. Over 450 have come through Greentown. They've created over 8,400 jobs and raised $2.2 billion in funding. And we're even more excited that in just 1 year, Houston has grown from 16 startups to over 60. But they can't do it alone. And that's why what we're talking about today is so important. We spend a lot of time building ecosystems that can be with investors, that can be with universities, that can be with corporate partners, because we see the need to constantly be generating the new companies coming out of universities, but also partnering with the corporate partners on the other side, because especially in Houston, the incumbent energy industry and all of the amazing companies that are here is where the technology coming out of universities and coming out of incubators like Greentown can really get to scale.
Very good, thank you. And your neighbor just a block away is the Ionyon. Jan, what can you tell us about the Ionyon's ecological niche and the ecosystem as a whole?
So, I mean, well, thank you for having us here, George, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. And I'm probably the one around the table that's the least focused on energy, but it's a lot of similarity with what actually Greentown Labs is doing, in that we are really about facilitating programs that will convene and connect people in the ecosystem. And it's all about connecting those stakeholders. And Laura alluded to many of them. You know, there's corporate, there's the investment community that I think is critical for Houston. And there's the ideas that both come out of the universities, as well as the individuals that are leaning into the ecosystem, as well as the corporate. Where do they actually find an outlet? Where do they find a network and connection? And then there's the accelerators and incubators that actually are sort of programmatically binding those together. So often when I talk about the Ion, Ion is where the future of Houston is not only being imagined, but it's where we are building it every day. And that actually goes for the Ion district, which is the larger area in Midtown, which the Ion and Greentown Labs is part of. We're already seeing that as people are coming in and visiting with us. I think that the corporates are increasingly leaning in, with corporate sponsors that are supporting our work, as well as tenants in the building. We're seeing that with investors increasingly starting to look at Houston through space that they can actually be at the Ion, and to sort of connect with that deal flow that we're starting to develop and see more and more of coming out of Houston. We're increasingly seeing the academics discovering that they need an outlet after they sort of graduate. Where do they take their IP after the university is sort of done, and where do they collide that? And then we're designing those programs, which help accelerate those. And super excited about the accelerators we're running out of there. They're built around sort of key top verticals, that we focus on. We are focused on smart cities, which is maybe not energy, but it certainly plays into the future of the energy. Aerospace innovation, it's an interesting partnership around what we're doing with NASA, and actually sort of the give and take of NASA IP technology. Battery technology comes into that, remote operations. We are partnered with Div Inc., which is really focused on maybe one of the key assets of Houston. How do we support Black, brown, and women entrepreneurs and innovators so they can be a big partner there? And they actually run sort of topical accelerator programs based on the needs in the city. And they're actually heading into actually going to do an energy accelerator also. And then our partnership with Rise Alliance, where Clean Energy Accelerators is kind of running in partnership there. So we're kind of trying to be a broader than the Greentown, and try to bring that together and sort of be that place where that happen. And I think as a city that is the incumbent in energy, I think that we have a job to do. It is not a given that we will be leading moving forward. And that's where we are leaning into with all the partners to build that. So, Jordan.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. And Barbara, we've heard a number of things about corporate partners. You were one of the original corporate partners in the Houston ecosystem. Can you tell us how that works, and what your role has been and is, and what you see it being in the future?
Sure. And hey, George, thanks for inviting me to attend with these great friends and colleagues. So when I was at Chevron, first of all, I moved to Houston in 2013 from the Bay Area. And I've told this stat many times, but I've never told it where someone from Stavanger is on the panel, because I said we had, in Chevron Technology Ventures, we had more portfolio companies from Stavanger, Norway than Houston, Texas. And I wanted to know why, especially since I had just moved to Houston, Texas. So it really began the journey of how startup ecosystems flourish, and the role that corporates play. So from a strictly company perspective, my job was to figure out how to collaborate with these external innovators and use the lessons from those to change how we thought about this inside the company. But I think a couple of other things, using all those lessons, there was an opportunity for our organization to help the ecosystem broadly, and the ecosystem in Houston on how incumbents run their core business and think about innovation, because those are two really different things. Working with other leaders here in Houston on the strategy around energy transition and the strategy around innovation, and how those can be part of the overall strategy of Houston. And the last thing I would say is that corporates are not monoliths. Every one of them is different. And the advice I give them is understand what your ambition for innovation is. Like, why do you want to do this and what are you going to do with it? And then who are you going to put out there in an ecosystem? And what are you going to task them to do? I think when you, and you know, I know Jan with corporates, understanding what they think they are going to get out of this and what are they are going to give. That's a critical dimension, I would say, to think about.
Very good, very good. You know, entrepreneurship and tech startups and innovation are not new things. They've been around for a while, but it seems that energy entrepreneurship is perhaps distinctly difficult. And so what I'll ask each of you are, what are the biggest challenges in bringing energy transition innovation to market? And what are some things you can talk about that are emerging to help entrepreneurs and innovators overcome those challenges? And Barbara, I'll start back with you.
Okay, and maybe I'll talk about the challenges, and then my colleagues can talk about the solutions. How about that? So you're right. Energy innovation is challenging. It's a lot of tough tech, as Laura mentioned. It's got long development time horizons. It's not always conducive to the standard venture capital investment model. It's expensive to develop. It requires prototyping and lab equipment. In order to demonstrate it, you usually have to get out in the field and do things at scale. The expectations around all of that have a lot of safety and environmental and reliability considerations. Energy innovation is rarely going to be greenfield. For those of you who kind of know that language, it's going to have to be integrated in with the existing system. So understanding how that works and who to work with. And then if it's a physical thing that you've developed, you need a supply chain. And so you need to build that. So if you can't scale it, it doesn't matter because, well, it doesn't matter because it won't be innovation that matters, right? Because the energy system is so big, and if it isn't scaled, you won't have impact. So those are all the challenges and probably lots more. But you know, a lot of smart people are thinking about programs and tools to be able to chip away at those various challenges.
Jan, can you address a few?
So I'd say that, you know, Barbara, she has experience from the big industry, and building to scale to some degree is what Houston is good at. And I think we need to figure out how to harness that. Innovating, we also are really good at. It's just not the traditional way of innovating, maybe in some of the ecosystem that we kind of often look at, like Silicon Valley and Boston. It's like, oh, that to our strength. And I think Houston needs to get better at getting out of your comfort zone to some degree. How do you actually get a little bit uncomfortable from a corporate perspective in how you approach innovation? How much more open do you need to be to engage around that? And maybe innovation and the scale that the corporate can do it on is how you scale it, but maybe the ideas needs to be more open and collaborative in terms of where we get there. So I think that's I see one of the sort of the barriers to entry. The second one is really the capital. Capital is critically important. I think Houston may have more capital than many other cities in competing markets. We're just not used to investing it the way that startups need that money. So if somebody have 100 acres of land somewhere, you know, a Houston investor will buy that if there is a potential for minerals or something. But getting them to invest in a startup is much harder. So how do you get that? Because you can't invest, you have to invest in 10 or 20 companies to de-risk your investment. So I think there's education and an opportunity for both working with the Rice Alliance, with the Ionyon, with Greentown Labs, and other organizations to help actually our capital in Houston understand how to invest that to help accelerate that energy transition. So I think that actually is one of the key things, in my view, is that how do we then retain and attract and sort of recruit and retain the startups that actually are launched here, because that's ultimately why they leave.
Brad, I imagine you have a few things to say.
You know, I do, and I come from a university perspective, and so let me address some of that. We see a lot of early stage technologies and early stage founders, and they have a great technology, but they don't always have a technology that a customer can use off the shelf or that really fits the need. And so early on, one of the solutions is to help early stage founders with their product market fit, to help them understand, is this a product or a technology that a customer will use? And so, I can talk about a few specific programs, like we're involved in the National Science Foundation I-Core program, which specifically has a founder go talk to, or a technologist go talk to 100 different customers to understand what are the problems that the technology solves, and will that customer pay for it? One of the newest ones that I'm excited about is working with the Chevron Venture Studio program, where entrepreneurs will be connected with technologies that come out of universities. And so these will be university and federal lab technologies. So we're excited to be a part of that. You mentioned, George, the business plan competition. So the business plan competition is a university competition. So we see lots of early stage energy technologies that come through and compete. And we've had a number go public at unicorn kind of valuations. But what's partly exciting to me being here in Houston is that we've had a number of these companies come through the business plan competition, meet investors in Houston or meet corporates in Houston, and relocate to Houston and to Texas. So it's exciting to see that some of the programs that we do draw folks here. And for an early stage company, for instance, that is looking for understanding how to launch that company, or make connections with investors, or meet corporates, is a reason why we launched the Clean Energy Accelerator last year. And we did the first cohort, and we've opened applications for the second cohort now, and that applications close next week on the 31st. But we hope to bring 10 to 15 early stage energy technology companies to come to Houston to participate in the Clean Energy Accelerator in conjunction with the Ionyon and others. And we've already seen great success from companies that participated last year. One of the companies was accepted into the Chevron Catalyst program. A company from Canada is launching their pilots here in Houston, and other founders are either moving their companies here or have recruited employees here. So we're excited about what the potential is for these programs to help further build up the ecosystem in Houston.
And Laura, from your perspective in a specifically climate tech focused incubator, but spanning both Houston and Boston, what are the biggest challenges you see in bringing energy entrepreneurship innovation to market?
So I want to talk about Houston first. And one of the things is when I was previously at the city of Houston and we did our climate action plan and our energy transition strategy, we realized that for the first time in Houston, and this was pretty momentous for our city, that we had local leadership and government support around energy transition and climate. And we had industrial and corporate support around climate and energy transition. And all of a sudden, both sides were setting incredible ambitious goals about how we are going to lead a global energy transition and take action on climate change. And then we kind of sat and said, well, do we actually know how to do this? And the answer is technology. And so in all of the energy transition strategies that are moving forward right now, innovation and technology is absolutely the center of that. And so this is a challenge and a huge opportunity for Houston, because Greentown came to Houston specifically to help fill that gap and build on what has been happening in Houston for a long time, but needed to really expand and take off. The Ionyon had their grand opening just last week or two, and everything that Rice is doing with their accelerator program. So you can see how it's really all coming together. And so it was a challenge, I think, historically, because we didn't have some of these programs compared to Boston, where the ecosystem there is a little bit more developed after years and years and years of working together. But the amazing part about Houston is that when our community commits to something, they can do it bigger and better than anyone else.
Well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and one of the things that Barbara mentioned earlier, I'll come back to you, Barbara, is the role of the incumbent companies. And I'll kind of phrase the question this way. We know that entrepreneurs are often depicted, and often they see themselves in sort of a David versus Goliath role with respect to established industry. But in energy specifically, that may not be a formula for success. So if you could talk about what the role of incumbent companies is in entrepreneurship, both in supporting the startup entrepreneurs and becoming entrepreneurial themselves, which may also be a challenge, if others want to opine as well. But I'll start with Barbara.
Sure, and maybe it shouldn't have been David. Maybe if it was Laura or Barbara, you'd get a different answer. Okay. So I've thought a lot about this, certainly in my time at Chevron, and then seeing lots of other incumbents, and make a plug for your executive ed because you have a business innovation class, and a lot of corporate employees come in, and what they want to understand is how do we use innovation to help with the change agenda of my company. And, so I think it's a very topical one. My perspective is that we can't do it just with the incumbents. We can't do it just with the startups. And I'm talking about evolving the energy system to a lower carbon future. We need both. But they operate in very different ways, and so being able to work together is difficult. Most of the incumbents, well, first of all, they are incumbents. They satisfy needs today, so they are operators. And the kind of success for operations thinks about things like safety and things like unit costs and things like reliability. So it tries to push change out. Okay, you can see where I'm going on that. It also has to do continuous improvement, but it rarely invites in transformational change. It just wants to push it out. So the operators and the incumbents see what's the problem with the current, but they really have a hard time seeing the leapfrog. I think that's just normal in sort of survival mode. The innovator sees an opportunity, and Brad was talking, they don't really know whether or not it'll fit a market need. They think it will. And so there's the opportunity. It is rare that an entrepreneur will have something that fits an enterprise need. Why would it, right, at that scale? And so you've got to go somewhere between testing new ideas and being very wide, open aperture on that. And then when do you narrow it down and say, this is the thing I want to scale? Because you can't scale everything. And so I think that's the opportunity to work together. And all kinds of companies have figured out different models by which they open themselves up to this broad aperture of innovation, keep their operations still doing what they need to do, and gradually introduce change. And we're going to need a lot of that in the energy transition.
Yes, Jan.
Yeah, so I think there's one word I sort of hear more and more now in the sort of corporate collision, and it's open innovation. And it's really, to some degree, the ecosystem and
That's 2 words.
Open innovation. No, well, that's true. There's 2 words. You're right, Barbara. You're right. Foreigners, what do we know? Stavanger. But open innovation is one by which, to some degree, it's sort of like I see the corporates coming to the table and wanting to participate and work with us because they're kind of like, I'm kind of trapped in my own world. I do great innovation inside my walls, but I need to get out and I need to actually be exposed to some of the entrepreneurs and find my role in that ecosystem for the early stage. And then down the road, be that scaling partners, the piloting that allows you to do that. Examples of some of the successes, Chevron has been we saw Exxon coming to us, which is, was an interesting, from our perspective, and I'm very welcome that they step up into this one. Ramco is joining us as a sponsor, but also what Brad is doing with the clean energy accelerators allow that to create a pipeline where does the corporates then go and find that ideas? And then Halliburton Labs just did their demo days, and that's another one that's like, they actually created a company on the side that actually takes care of their innovation, and they're wanting to innovate in their lane, but nevertheless do it in some of a more open way. And then the fact that Div Inc. also looking at sort of tapping into the Black, Brown, and Women founders, and actually do a clean energy accelerator in their space is super interesting because that actually opens up the funnel even further and then bring them to the table. And our role at the Ionyon is really to help collide the corporates then with the capital, the opportunity, and founders and those market fits, if you will. But that's where we learn from each other and collaborate.
There's an interesting question that's come in from the audience. It particularly resonates with me as an intellectual property attorney. And in these interactions between the large companies or their venture arms and the startup entrepreneurs, to what extent is technology shared or proprietary ideas, and to what extent do the incumbents sort of, help the startup figure out the technical solutions? I thought that was an interesting question, and I'm not sure who would like to address it. Perhaps Laura.
I would love to. It goes to the part about the incumbents, and they have such a great role to play, and that they really are reaching out across the aisle to folks like the Ionyon, to the startups in Greentown. So Greentown is an incubator, but we run accelerator programs, and we work very closely to matchmake with our corporate partners, and we look to them and we say, what is your need? What areas of technology are you having trouble? Where are you looking for that new technology? And how can we put out a call to bring the best and brightest startups all across the world together to help? And so we have two really great programs right now. One is called the Low Carbon Hydrogen Accelerator, and we're working with Shell, we're working with the City of Houston, we're working with EPRI, and they work very closely together. The partners actually handpick the startups. Greentown helps bring them together. We do that convening, we do that colliding, we bring the startups the resources that they need, but they get to work behind closed doors with incumbent industry leaders. And that is invaluable experience to both of them, because the technology that comes as a result of that partnership is going to be better because of the expertise and because of getting to see how technology is being formed and have the opportunity to tweak it early on. Another program that we're working on, and it's in its second year, is called the Carbon to Value Initiative, because obviously carbon capture and is a very big focus right now in technology, and definitely in Houston. But once we capture all of this carbon, what are we going to do with it? And so we run an accelerator program with partners in New York and industry partners really across the board about how can we develop more and more carbon tech companies so that as we start capturing carbon, we have a full ecosystem, we have a full supply chain and business chain so that we can truly implement the technology and the solution.
Hey, George, can I add something?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a world that I know well of, and I appreciate the question from the audience member. So it depends a little bit on what the incumbents' motivations are. And I'm going to say both, pluses and minuses. If the intention is to work with them and ultimately whatever it is that the startup developed could potentially find its way into being part of the product line or business line of the company, then I think doing joint development and starting to commingle IP, can be synergistic in a positive way. If the intention is that what you want is to create suppliers for your industry that have multiple customers, commingling the IP makes it very difficult. And people have different expressions for that, but it's really a form of exclusivity. And if you put the exclusivity in too early in the game, one, you will deprive that startup of other potential investors because no one wants to come in when there's clause from others. You might deprive that startup of customers. And so if you as an incumbent aren't, if your demand isn't big enough and you want them to have multiple customers, then don't do things that would prohibit having multiple customers. And, the fact of the matter is you went out to source external innovation, but it's a slippery slope to then wanting to control it, which is what incumbents do. So I do think this is one of the risks, and startups are right to proceed carefully and make sure that everyone's intentions are understood and their actions are accordingly.
Brad, I'd love to hear your experience.
Yeah, there's another aspect on incumbents, and there's an irony with the Ionyon, and Jan knows this, that so the Ionyon is in what was the Sears department store. And we've seen industries all over that have been disrupted with new players. And so Sears was the Amazon of the day, was disrupted by Walmart and Target and probably others, and those now, Walmart and Targets, are being disrupted by Amazon and others. And I've, got 2 decades of being a part of seeing the ecosystem here in the incumbents. And it's really, I'm really encouraged by what's happening here. Because if I look back 10 years ago, most of the oil and gas companies who participated in our energy events were looking for innovations in order to reduce their cost or to find more oil and produce it more cheaply. Okay, that was then, and now all of the major energy companies are not only looking for that, and I think they're still looking for that, but they're also looking for ways to offset the impacts of the carbon that is an outcome of this, and finding ways through carbon capture and utilization and storage to offset that. But then they're also looking at a third area, that is the new renewable energy sources, that like battery and solar and others. So there has been a tremendous change, I think, among the major incumbents and the major oil companies that are very much interested now in getting to net zero carbon and developing alternative resources that are more renewable. And so where Chevron was the first to engage with us, Shell quickly followed, then BP, Total, Equinor, ConocoPhillips, Exxon, Saudi Aramco. All of the super major oil companies, oil and gas companies, are now energy companies and are looking for not just cost-saving solutions, but solutions for the future. So it's extremely encouraging.
Well, I think that's a good point to sort of zoom out a little bit and just look at Houston globally, Houston as a metropolis. So I'd like to kind of combine 2 questions together in this respect. So what are some of the things, I'd like each of your opinion on this, what are some of the things that make Houston stand out as a hub for energy entrepreneurship? And then what are some of the things that are missing? What gaps do we have, if any, to make our ecosystem complete? And I'd like your opinion on each of those. And I guess I'll start with Laura.
So I love this question. One of the things that makes Houston unique is that, so when Greentown came to Houston, we had entrepreneurs knocking on our door before we were ever there. They were excited. They had been working on this, and they needed a space. They needed that convening entity, and so much has grown. These entrepreneurs were coming from the energy industry, right? Some of them were second or third career. Some of them had decades of experience. And so that inherently makes the technology that's being developed in Houston have an edge, right? They have been in it, they've lived it. I have heard stories about folks who said, I had a way to do it better. I had an idea and I tried to bring it forward and was told, focus on the status quo. We're not in the business of changing things. We're in the business of doing what we do better and more efficient. And so for various reasons, now is the time that folks in the energy industry with that expertise are coming forward saying, I want to do my part around climate. I want to start my own business. There's more funding for climate tech than ever before. And so it's a really opportune time. And Houston does have some ingredients that really no other city has. But the flip side of that is also a challenge. So Greentown was founded outside of Boston in Somerville, right next to MIT and next to Harvard and all of the universities that are there. We were founded by 4 entrepreneurs who came together who needed a space. And so Greentown sort of organically became the pipeline destination for entrepreneurs coming right out of universities. So in Texas, everything's bigger in Texas, including our universities. We don't see the same volume of startups coming out of schools that you would expect compared to places like Massachusetts. Now, huge shout out to Rice because they are doing an amazing, amazing job. I'm thinking about some of the larger schools. We've got the University of Texas, we've got Texas A&M, we've got U of H. There are incredible schools all across the state of Texas. And so it goes back to that idea of energy entrepreneurship is unique and it is hard. And so our universities have a role to play in teaching how you create an energy startup. Very different than how you create an app, right? If an app has some sort of bug, you just update it. If an energy company has a bug, worst case, people run out of power, right? But there are lots of much bigger and badder things that can happen. And so the idea and how you teach entrepreneurship around energy companies needs to grow in Texas. And then the thing is that our universities are the biggest energy research institutions in the country. So they're getting tons of money. They have IP, they have some of the smartest minds. It's getting the universities really kickstarted into taking that entrepreneurial spirit and getting it to commercialization. And that in itself is really hard. And that's a program that Greentown is really excited to be working on with the support of Chevron and folks like Barbara, with Rice and their incredible programming, with the University of Houston, with the University of Texas, with Texas A&M. We're bringing in support from MIT because we learned some of the best practices there. So how can we bring all these universities together and talk about energy entrepreneurship, how it is truly unique and how it needs its own special kind of carve out in the entrepreneurship ecosystem. But also, really importantly, we know that you can't just copy and paste something from the East Coast or the West Coast and bring it to Texas and expect it to work. And so how do we create a uniquely Texas program, bringing all of our special ingredients, capitalizing on that energy industry history and knowledge that we already have, to continue our ecosystem to grow?
Brad, I think the Rice Alliance and the Rice Business Plan competition are evidence that the world will come to Houston. Can you expound on what the strengths are and then what's maybe is missing in the ecosystem here?
Yeah, and we talked about a number of these, so I'll keep this a little bit shorter. I tried to come up with what are 3 strengths. I think I came up with 5. The huge strength is that the energy industry is already here, and there's a tremendous amount of technology talent that's here. And the energy industry is fully bought on to the energy transition. That's one. Second, the energy investors, many of the corporates are also investors with corporate venture capital funds, and those all have a presence here. But there's also other energy investors, angels, VCs, and private equity that are helping to fund these companies depending upon the stage of their development. A third is the ecosystem itself. As I said earlier in my remarks, I think we have one of the most robust energy ecosystems of anywhere in the country. And fourth is the programming that we have that's available to those companies depending upon which stage. And fifth, my plug for Ionyon is that I think the Ionyon is transformative for Houston. Rice has made and I'll do the plug for him. Rice has made over $100 million commitment for the Innovation District, which is where Greentown Labs is located. I think that the Innovation District, the Ionyon District, will be transformative for the city of Houston in the coming years. And we'll look back a decade from now and say that, that was a change in the trajectory of Houston and where it was going by the impact that the Ionyon has made on the community.
And I want to give both Barbara and Jan a chance to weigh in. So Barbara, I'll turn to you. Again, what makes Houston stand out and what might be missing?
Sure. And, Brad obviously copied my paper. So
well, I knew who to copy, Barbara.
So all of those things are right. We have skin in the game, which is both a strength and a challenge. But I think what's missing is something that this momentum will deliver. We need success. We need success in growing the startup number of startups, so there's not a risk to an employee. If they give up one job or if a startup fails, they can just go into another one. So the employment in this area needs to be more vibrant. We need successes from an exit perspective, either IPOs or acquisitions, because that will teach the investors that this is a fertile area. It's one thing to invest. You really want to get your money back out. We need successes in scale, and we need some successes between the established players and the new players. So all of those things I think are starting, but I think when you get some successes, then the second and third are always a lot easier than the first. The last thing I'll say is we've got all these things because we're an incumbent city around energy. Change is hard, so there's momentum, but we got to make sure that everyone comes along with change, and we make sure that certain communities aren't disadvantaged by it.
Very good. Jan?
Yeah, so I think Barbara opened up with an interesting remark, and we are the incumbent, but that's a risk. And I think that's one of the important things that I think we're starting to see here. It's like we're realizing that there's a risk. We can't take it for granted that we will be the energy transition city. And, so that I think we're seeing now, because I see the corporates are realizing that. And I think that I mentioned earlier, open innovation, that's increasingly that's leaning into that. I also think that there's one other strength that Houston has, which we often actually don't even think about. It's like we're a manufacturing stronghold. And if you think about what we're doing in manufacturing, I think this is one that actually really plays well into that next phase here of energy transition, because it's really all about manufacturing at scale again. And I keep making scale here because it's so important when you think about energy systems. And we fundamentally understand energy systems here, so we can actually move in that direction. And we have the partnerships. I mean, we have, with the partnership with NASA, the partnership with the medical center, the partnership with the port, and we do things at scale here, and that's actually really important in Houston. And then the other thing I think is and I think you had alluded to too, is attracting and retaining talents and startups to Houston, has historically maybe been a little bit hard, not maybe as hard in the energy segment. But one of the things that is important, and if somebody chooses to come to Houston, if that is not a success for personal reasons, for company reasons, company sunset, you don't want to move again. So why, do you believe that there's an ecosystem in Houston, that there's employment opportunity that allows you to move your career and relocate your family and actually build a career in the future here? And I think that's an important part of that, sustaining that effort and being that. And then ultimately, I mean, if you have some success, the money will start, checks will be written, and success will prove and continue to grow.
Well, let me ask you about the money. An interesting question has come in from the audience about finance. Someone in our audience has pointed out that London and Paris have been very aggressive and forward in positioning themselves as financial hubs for green tech, to the point of issuing green bonds, for example. Is that something that needs to happen here in order for the real success to take hold? And who would like to address that?
Well, I'll make one comment. Whether it is at the city level, the state level, or the federal level, having the right investment climate, not just in the early stage, but all the way through to scale, is going to be critical. And the dollars do get bigger as we scale. I think we've done a good job of pouring more money into early stage and supporting. No one still likes the first plant of a kind. And so, yes, having those vehicles by which whether it's green bonds, whether it's investment credits for taking that first chance on a project, I think is going to be really important.
And Barbara, that sets up one of the last questions I was going to ask. Since we are the Baker Institute for Public Policy, we are obviously very concerned in policy improvements that can be made. So in terms of policy needs, either governmental or institutional, what are some of the key points that you would each want our audience to take away as necessary policy improvements to help Houston thrive and continue to thrive as the energy capital? And Barbara, would you like to expand on what you were just mentioning?
Sure. And, what I was going to say was, I think upstream of policy is vision. And I think Houston's done a fantastic job of setting a vision towards the future. I think Texas needs to do the same. But then once you've got a vision towards that, then you look at what's it going to cost and how can Texas lead the energy transition, and then having financing vehicles, which is just another form of innovation, is going to be required.
Brad, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would echo what Barbara, you just said about the financing vehicles. I'm not a policy person. I would say I'm more of an entrepreneur and a capitalist, and it is necessary for policies that incent early stage and later stage energy transition companies, and so that's one thing that I think is important, and you touched on that. A couple other things. The second thing is that we and other universities in Texas have a lot of smart PhDs doing research in the labs that are coming up with new technologies, and we really want, and many of those are not, many of those are foreign-born students. We would love to have more and more opportunities for foreign-born, really bright, smart PhD students to stay here when they graduate, not have to return to their home country, and launch these technology startups here in the U.S. So anything that can be done, to encourage those PhD students who have a cool technology to stay here and start companies. And then kind of last I would say is that not everybody knows that Texas is the #1 wind producer of electricity, and I think the #2 producer of solar power. And I think, Barbara, to your point of a vision, we need to promote the successes that Texas has. I don't know that the rest of the country, the rest of the world understands our existing capabilities in renewable energy. And I think we need to leverage that in order to encourage more clean tech entrepreneurs to want to start and build their companies here.
Laura, I know you've given this some thought in some very specific realms. What would you like to share?
So to the idea of vision, which is so important, when I think somebody in the audience mentioned something that was happening in London, and is that something that could be copied here in Houston? When the Trump administration announced that they were going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, you had this kind of vacuum in the United States where you didn't have a clear federal vision. And so it kind of trickled down then to states. And if you were in a state that stepped forward, like New York, like California, and you had a roadmap to follow. But in Texas and in much of the rest of the country, cities had to step up. And decarbonizing any city is really difficult, but decarbonizing the energy capital of the world is a huge challenge. So the city of Houston and Mayor Turner are doing great things, but when you think about that from a policy perspective, like you end up with a patchwork that's never ideal. And so, looking to what can happen now, but also understanding that the timeline, the urgency around the climate crisis means we shouldn't wait too long for a policy solution to come in that will solve everything. And that the researchers in the universities, that the entrepreneurs at Greentown Labs, that the partners at incumbent industries all have a role to play. We still need to be doing everything we can as quickly as possible. That success in climate tech is not just getting investment, it's getting the technology deployed to the communities that need it most. And so this is one of those neat areas where Houston can develop the technology, but we also need the technology because we are impacted by climate change on a daily basis. And so right now at the federal government, there's 2 potential pathways for support that would help entrepreneurs and help deployment in a very low-key, not political kind of way. Obviously, there are bigger programs that are moving forward in the House and the Senate, and who knows what will happen there. But in the America Competes Act, there's a program to create a national clean energy incubator network that would provide funding for incubators to support things like hiring interns, like deploying your first pilot technology, relatively small amounts that can make the absolute difference for a startup just getting started. And another opportunity is supporting the Department of Energy and their Office of Technology Transfer. I am at ARPA-E right now, meeting with folks from DOE to talk about how can we bring more support from federal programs to get the technology deployed into scale into Houston.
And Jan, if you could expand on policy, and when I posed this question, I deliberately mentioned government or institutional policy, and I think you may have some opinions.
Yeah, so Laura talked earlier about the challenge maybe we have here in Texas, and actually a lot of universities, it's how do you actually commercialize your IP, and and part of that is the natural organic ecosystem around the institution and the natural to go out and commercialize, we don't have that in Texas. I think we're underperforming across the board, and it's not just Houston institution, it's all of Texas academic institutions. We're not really good at, we kind of write papers and we put them on the shelf. How do you then, so we actually we can't just copy what they're doing in Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area or in Boston, because we know it doesn't work. So we have to be creative about how we do the IP from the universities. And I think that there are universities now looking very hard at, what is the incentives I put into place to actually get the technology commercialized? As students and faculty members want to commercialize it, how do I don't license that to death up front before you actually do it? And that actually plays well with corporate, because corporate are increasingly not interested in taking all the risk of sort of exploring a technology, a new IP. So startups helping de-risk that with corporates investing in that de-risking ultimately could become a supplier or a merger acquisition opportunity also. So really building that pipeline and allowing that IP and the students and the faculty members to actually maybe take that into commercialization is helpful, or at least building it to a place where you can do a viable and sort of a market fit in there. That ultimately I think is a key thing, and I think we will see both Ionyon, Greentown Labs, and other institutions benefiting because we will have deeper partnerships with the universities in that for commercialization. It doesn't necessarily have to be a faculty member and student that take it commercial. It could be the ecosystem that exists at Greentown, at Ionyon, at other places that gets exposed to it and have an opportunity to say, oh, I would take that. How do I have an idea of how to use that and commercialize it.
And I think, Jan, what you and Barbara and our other panelists have woven together is the fact that it's not just important to innovate in technology, how we make things, how we consume things, but also to innovate in how we do things. And I think we've seen some innovations that are very promising and some more that would be needed and are helpful. We've about come to the end of our program today, and I want to thank our audience for tuning in and listening to our discussion today. I certainly want to thank very much our panelists for being here with us. And again, I want to thank the Center for Energy Studies for partnering with the McNair Center for Entrepreneurship and Economic Growth and the Baker Institute event staff for helping us put on this program. Again, my name is George Webb with the McNair Center for Entrepreneurship and Economic Growth here at the Baker Institute. We hope you enjoyed part 2 of our 2-part series, and we hope that you will also take a look back at part 1 of our 2-part series, and will tune into and attend other Baker Institute events in the future. From Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is the Baker Institute for Public Policy, signing off. Thank you.